welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by a truly prolific writer who has written a ton of wonderful books, but we are here to discuss the newest wonderful book in particular, and I am so excited. So welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. My name is Marie Bostwick, and thank you for that nice introduction, Jen. The book we're talking about today is, in fact, my 22nd novel. It's called The Book Club for Troublesome Women. And it is the story of four 60s era suburban housewives who live in a pretty buttoned up suburb in Northern Virginia. They form a book club, and the first book that they read among many is Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. It was a blockbuster in 1963, and reading that book and the friendship that they are going to create together changes everything for these four characters.
It is so fascinating. I love the time period in which it is set, the way that you sort of look at the reception of this like truly world-changing book and how it changes not just like the lives of these individual women, but the society around them slowly but surely. So I'd love if we could talk about the inception point for this novel. Was it an image or a character, or was it just the idea of the book itself, the feminine mystique? Where did this take root?
Well, I can never predict where an idea is going to come from at this point. This particular time, it happened about 3 years ago when I was having a conversation with my mother. My mother was 89 then. And I got to tell you, my mother is not like your average 92-year-old woman. She is a quick draw with a cocktail shaker. She is sharp as a tack. Her lifetime exit strategy is to be shot by a jealous wife. That's her plan. And she is also an avid reader. So we were discussing books that particular day. And she said to me, honey, I don't know if I ever told you about The Feminine Mystique, but that book changed my life. And I said, you're kidding, really? Tell me more. And within moments of her beginning to talk about what reading this book had meant to her as a young wife and mother in 1963, I knew what my next book needed to be about. And in fact, I was deep into researching something else. I threw that thing over the wall, called my editor and said, this is the book. This is what we're going to do next. So that's where it came from. Came from Mom. Thanks, Mom.
Wow, that is really lovely. And it does segue beautifully into my questions about your research about the time period and the book itself. You say, I think, I'm totally going to blank on the word. It's not an epigraph, but there is like a little inscription before the book itself starts where you say that the feminine mystique didn't solve the problem, but it put a name to it. And that is so interesting to me. So could you talk about that and, where you started to sort of, I guess, like the beginning of your interaction with Friedan's text?
Right. Well, I mean, then the first thing I had to do was I had to read The Feminine Mystique, which I hadn't. I'm not a spring chicken, but I was an infant when that book was released. So practically, I think the very first page, Friedan talks about what she calls this strange stirring and the problem which had no name. And this was very prevalent in the early 1960s, this problem that didn't have a name of women who theoretically had everything. They had reached the pinnacle of feminine existence according to society. They were educated, they had gotten married, they had children, they had a nice home in the suburbs. So they'd been told they should be happy, and they weren't. They felt empty inside, and a lot of them were bearing this silently, certain that the problem was just them, because like, gosh, everyone is happy and I should be happy. Why aren't I happy? And so they felt guilty about this and ashamed, and their shame brought them into silence. Friedan's book broke down that wall, and it said, it's not you. you're not the only one. And I think, when you go back and you read some of the things that how women were reacting to that at the time, a lot of it was like relief because it was like, oh my gosh, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm not crazy. I mean, they'd really started to feel that way. And I think my mother certainly had that reaction too.
Mhm. Oh, that is so fascinating. And it was a truly, you know, you can't talk about something that doesn't have a name, and I
This
think
is
you
it.
also mentioned there that just naming it begins the revolution. And I
Yeah.
love how the book enters this town in the Virginia suburb of DC via Charlotte. And I want to talk about all of the four central characters because I love them all so much, but I would love to begin with Charlotte if we can. So, where did her character come from? And, how did you imagine the impact that she was going to have on the lives of these women?
Right. Charlotte, I think, is going to be a fan favorite on this book. And she is really, she is not like the others. She's from Manhattan. She's quite wealthy and in some ways very self-assured, and yet not at the same time. She has deep insecurities and doubts about herself. And she really shouldn't because she has a lot going for her. But she is somebody who, she is a pot stirrer, and I like that. She's got a bit of a sarcastic edge to her. And, I was thinking about where did she come from in a way, and I was doing an interview the other day, and I realized I don't know that I consciously did that, but there is a Stephen Sondheim musical called Company. I, as a kid, was a huge fan of musicals, and of course, it was. I was a grown up before I actually ever saw a Broadway show, but I had every soundtrack there was and memorized all the lyrics. And Company had a character named Joanne, and she was this sort of, caustic but funny and had an edge to her, but also deeply, deeply unhappy woman. And she does this number in there called The Ladies Who Lunch, and she was like another chance to disapprove, another brilliant zinger, another reason not to move, another vodka stinger. And it just seemed to me that that was an anthem for a lot of women in this age who were so smart and so angry that their intelligence was being just wasted, and they knew it, but they didn't know what to do about it.
Mm. Yeah, and when you really think about like where the country was at that time, I think that anger really makes sense too. The whole time I was reading, I was kind of thinking about, the 50s and 60s focus on the housewife and housekeeping and etiquette and keeping up appearances in that post-war era. And it all kind of feels like a sort of like a backtracking, trying to put things back in the box after Rosie the
Yep.
Riveter.
No, exactly. Exactly. Here are these women, they helped win the war. And then it was like, way to go back to the kitchen, make meatloaf, not noise. And it was, I think, hard for a lot of women because they'd had a taste of a certain amount of freedom and, what we now call, right, self-actualization.
Mhm.
Um, it's like the feeling that your talents are being used in a good way. And look, for many people that can be homemaking. And that's one of my points in the book is that there are lots of good and right ways to be a woman, but it's about having those options. And for many people, and they had tasted a little bit of that and then said, yeah, now that's over. Now you have to go back to what you were doing. And it just wasn't a good fit for a lot of folks.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, as the source of like this nameless problem, it just makes so much sense. So yeah, let's return to our book club ladies. A two-part question. Was there one with whom it was the easiest to connect and find their voice? And the flip side, was there one who was the most challenging?
I think Charlotte it was the easiest. I probably had Elaine Stritch in my mind, and she was fun to write because she is sassy and she is funny in a lot of ways. But there's always that, dig a little further, and there's probably some anger that she doesn't even express quite to herself. So she was really easy. The Probably the harder one was Bitsy. She is the youngest member of the group. She is the quietest member of the group. And she was quiet in getting to know me
Mm.
as time. So it took some time for me to really dig deeper. And I think that is just because I think, you know, younger characters, younger people still are finding themselves. And so they don't always necessarily know who they are. So it can be harder for me as the author to know that too.
That is very interesting. Yeah, because you don't really know who you are yet when you're young, but yet a narrator, an author needs to know who you are, even if you don't. That's very,
Yeah.
very.
Yeah. And so in a way, I mean, I know this sounds like really kind of woo, but it's my job to help that character in a way, see what matters to her, what were the, what are the core things and what is it she really wants and what's standing in the way of her getting it. Very often for the young character, what's standing in the way of her getting it is herself, her doubts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what something the book does very well is it gets at all of the restrictions that were placed on women in the 60s in this sort of mid-century period. The the literal tangible ones, like through marriage or through society, through work or not working, what have you. But then those invisible ones that come from, what you have internalized from that system and what
Absolutely.
you tell yourself about yourself in a way. So I'm really curious about researching the time period and what life would have been like at that time because as you said, you were an infant, so you didn't, experience all of it directly through memory, did you research through periodicals or anything? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, I actually did. And now I do have an advantage because I was, conscious during the 1960s. So there were certain things, I have memories of the music and, it was fun to do these little things that I think will bring up nostalgia. Like at one point, the kids are playing Mousetrap. I mean, Mousetrap was like a big game in the 60s. And it was all over TV and everybody wanted Mousetrap. And by the way, on television, of course, it all worked way better than it did when you got the
It
actual,
always did, yes.
right? Like everything, and Captain Crunch cereal. I mean, yeah, like Captain Crunch cereal and Tang was considered a nutritious breakfast for a child in the 1960s. I lived through that, right? So I was able to tap into just some of my childhood and that was fun. But I also did go back and I did more, research on historically what was going on because of course while I lived through that, I wasn't super aware of many things that were I do actually have a memory of sitting in front of the television and watching Robert Kennedy's funeral.
Mhm.
But did it really register? So I had to go back and kind of sift through the historical events, certainly. But another thing I did was I bought vintage magazines because magazines were hugely, hugely important and influential to women and housewives of the day. It was their Pinterest, it was their TikTok. This is how they were, in fact, influenced. And when you read Friedan's book, which is fascinating, and even though, it doesn't quite translate into our time, and there are a lot of justifiable criticisms of Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, makes perfect sense. But for the time, it was quite revolutionary. And one of the things that made me so angry is how she exposes how, like, magazines and advertisers and companies really were invested in creating the feminine mystique, that the idea that women's fulfillment could be found in, vacuuming, right? Like that this was the thing. And so women literally were sold a bill of goods.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at those magazines, I was recently gifted a whole bunch of Life magazines from like late 50s, early 60s.
Oh, lucky you.
It's so cool. They're in terrible shape, like, but they're so interesting. And it's interesting to see just how gendered. I mean, you could say it about the whole thing, but ads were, like ads for women were just like they're supposed to be aspirational, but it's also like you'll be happy through cleaning or through making your husband happy or through having just
Right.
lip
This
shade.
cake mix will save your marriage.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, no, and it's so true. And then the other, and I really focus specifically on women's magazines,
Mm.
um, because that was, Better Homes and Gardens and those kinds of things, and McCall's, um, because they were just for that female audience. And it's fascinating. The other thing that was fascinating is like how bad the recipes were and how dreadful the photography of said recipes were. Clearly food styling was not a profession at this point. I mean, none of us would look at that stuff and be like, well, heck yes, I want to make spam and pineapple kebabs for my family tonight.
Oh,
So
true nightmare. It's like why are you putting everything in Jello? Why is this happening?
I gotta be frank. I actually like gelatin. I think it can be done well. I'm one of the few people I know who enjoys a tomato aspect, but I get it. They went way overboard with the gelatin thing. And why were they doing it? Because the Jello company that was so interesting too. So many things that, and we get this today, but I don't think people were always as aware. They were advertisements, but they made it look like they was like, oh, it's this recipe. Well, the recipe is sponsored by Jello, Dole, Kraft. And so they're selling their products with these really really awful recipes.
So I was looking at your website and you have a quote from the great Adriana Trigiani there who says Trigiani, I'm sorry, who says that no one writes female friendships like you, which is what a compliment from what a person. Like that is just like the greatest combination of compliment and author ever. What is
Yeah, Adri's great.
She is. What is your approach to writing female friendships and what is it you think that makes your depiction so strong?
That's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. I mean, my approach to it is I think they are vital.
Mm.
I think women need other women. And by the way, I say that as somebody who like I had struggled to make that happen. I am one of those women who sort of felt more comfortable with men for a long time because I was like, they're straight shooters, they're not complicated. Yeah, they're not complicated, but in some ways that means also they're not that interesting. And they don't get what I'm doing, and they certainly don't want to talk about it. And there comes a point in your life where as a woman, I just think we really, women tend to value community very much, but we really need it. And I think if I write women's friendships well, as Adri said, I think it's because I let them experience the ups and downs of friendship. I really believe the best friend is the one who will tell you the thing you don't want to hear but need to. And that if you can receive that, that's the real mark of friendship. Now, sometimes women can be mean and catty, but those people aren't your friends. So, like, find your friends. But your real ride or die, um, sometimes they're going to have to tell you hard things, and you may have falling outs from time to time. And the measurement is, do you get back to the relationship? So hopefully that's what I do. That's certainly what I try to do.
Yeah, that really resonates with me, I think, and with the depictions here, because oftentimes that conflict just comes from being authentic, not from
Mhm.
manipulation or from betrayal or what have you, but like the sort of conflict that comes from just different people wanting different things at the same time and showing how you can withstand that, I think really does make for very meaningful relationships.
Yeah. And I think, we all long to be seen, right?
Mm.
And that's a thing we say right now. And I think it's true. But sometimes being seen by your girlfriend is going to be seen that you in your hypocrisy, in your self-sabotage, you know, and it's got to be a strong relationship for somebody to be able to call you on your own baloney.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was so much fun to watch these women evolve as not just individuals, but as a group, their relationships change and adapt. And gosh, and it really made me think a lot too about like what book clubs mean for women specifically
Mm,
too, because this is a very modern term that I'm going to apply to a past time, but sort of like a safe space for women, where
yep,
they don't have to be acting in that moment as a mother or as a wife, but they can just be themselves.
yep. And I think something else book clubs does, the best of them, does for women. We are sort of, I don't know if we're trained or hardwired or both, but we like consensus as a whole. Not every woman, but we tend to like consensus. And consensus can be good. I think there's value in that. But there's also value in learning to express an opinion that is different from the group.
Mm.
And like, I went to my book club last night and we had different takes on the book. And I loved seeing how people were kind of, in that safe space, willing to disagree.
Mhm.
And I think that's wonderful. I think society could use a whole lot more like civil book club level disagreements where people, and one of the things and I'm not going to say which book club, but there was a thing that was said last night, and in my brain, I was like, no, that's dumb. And you know what? I shut up and I listened, and they changed my mind
Mm.
by the end of the conversation, which I thought was great. It's great that they could express themselves, and it was great that I could be open enough to a different point of view that I could be willing to change my opinion.
That is so fascinating. And yeah, that makes me think of it as an entirely different kind of safe space where you can share ideas without that immediate judgment. Because if that interaction were to happen on like, Twitter or something,
Yeah, no, don't do it on Twitter. It's
you
just
know,
it's a waste of time. It's a
yeah.
waste of time. Yeah. No, and I think it also, hopefully in that safe space, maybe trains us up a little bit to stand up for our opinions in a way that we can get people to hear us. And I think that's important training. And I think we all ought to do a whole lot more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agreement. And I think that this book in particular would be such a nice, like, meta choice for a book club. Like, let's read a
Mhm.
book about book clubs in our book club. Like, I think that would be, and it would start like very important conversations too about, like, I didn't encounter the feminine mystique until I was in my 20s. And, as you said, it is like, has aged poorly in some ways, but just for its role in history and in the women's movement, it is such an important text. And I think this is a really, like, if you haven't encountered her text before, this is going to be such a really lovely way to be introduced to it and sort of the world that it helped start to create.
Right. And I think if you can, sometimes there's a tendency right now for us to judge everything in terms of our modern opinions and what we know now.
Mm.
And there can be value in that sometimes. I think it's all right to go back and say, yeah, this is where things go wrong. But if you look at that book, it really was revolutionary for the time. And you cannot argue away the fact that it started a conversation that needed to be started. And I also think, even though, yes, Friedan, for one thing, she just left a whole lot of people out of the conversation. But I really think that if you read through it, there are things that are relevant to what's going on today too. Women are still kind of being like, we're being gaslit all the time, right? And told that this is how we're supposed to be. So I think there's historic value, but I think there may be, times when a modern audience who's never read this book before might read and go, heck yeah, I get that. I hear you. So it's worth reading again. It's a dry book. I'm not going to kid you. But I've read it like 5 times now or something, and it is very interesting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very important, like when we are looking at a text from history, I trained as a historian before I became a librarian, that, it's useful to both look at a text through the lens of your time, but also to try to understand the past on its own terms. My advisor used to say, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And I
Mhm.
think you do learn something about your own time, even by trying to take the past on its own terms. Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I love that saying. I might steal that.
Yeah.
And if I do, then it'll just be mine. And I'll own it. So, you know.
Yeah, put it out there. Everyone should know. So, gosh, thank you so much for joining us. What is next for you? What's on your horizon right now?
You know what? Honestly, what's next for me is like the world's longest book tour. I'm going to be on the road for something like 6 weeks and visiting 10 or 11 states. And I've got about 50 different events. And so it's just, in theory, I was supposed to be starting work on another book, but this book seems to have been creating a lot of buzz which I'm so grateful for. And I hope that it continues to follow. There came a moment when it's like, you know what? I have to give my full attention to this, and then I will work on the next thing. So right now, just what's next for me is me and my suitcase. That's it.
Nice. Well, Godspeed on your journey. That's
Thank you
very,
kindly.
very exciting. And thank you again for joining us. This has been really lovely.
Oh, I'm so glad. I really appreciate you had really insightful questions. So it was fun talking to you.
Thank you. Okay, listeners, it's your turn now. Please check out the book club for Troublesome Women. By the time that you hear this, it will be out in the world. So head to your favorite bookstore or library, perhaps, wherever you like to go for your books. It is now time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.